Inside the secret US plan to invade Canada in the 1930s, Canada and the United States. Two nations that share the world's longest undefended border, billions in annual trade, and about 2 million expats on either side. Sounds like the setup for a harmonious, syrup-soaked friendship. Not so fast. History suggests our relationship has been more of a rom-com where the laughs are punctuated by territorial squabbles, name-calling, and, at one point, detailed plans to invade each other. Hey friends, Wes here, veteran defense nerd and future asylum seeker in Canada. Take President Donald Trump's triad against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, labeling him weak and dishonest during a trade spat. Sure, Trudeau might have snagged the genetic lottery compared to most world leaders. Is it getting hot in here or is it just me? But Trump's verbal barrage wasn't just a random outburst. It was the latest chapter in a long saga of cross-border tensions. Turns out the US-Canada relationship hasn't always been as sweet as a Tim Hortons donut. The War of 1812 is one of those historical events that both Americans and Canadians vaguely remember from high school history class, but it holds a special place in the lore of US-Canada relations. For Canada, it's a story of underdog triumph and national identity. For the United States, well, it's mostly remembered for the burning of Washington, D.C., a rather humbling episode in American history. And for the British, well, it was a Tuesday. Let's set the stage. In 1812, the United States declared war on Britain, frustrated by British interference with American trade and their habit of impressing U.S. sailors into the Royal Navy. Canada, then a British colony, was caught in the crossfire. Americans assumed their northern neighbor would be an easy target, even counting on some Canadians to welcome annexation. After all, who wouldn't want freedom, apple pie, and eventually baseball? Turns out Canadians were pretty happy with their maple syrup, parliamentary government, and hockey, or whatever the 1812 equivalent was. The US quickly launched an invasion led by generals who probably should have stayed home polishing their medals. Despite the bravado, American forces underestimated Canadian resilience and British military support. In one of the war's most famous moments, British and Canadian forces captured Detroit without firing a single shot, thanks to a bluff involving indigenous allies and some clever maneuvering. Detroit residents surrendered faster than you can say, eh? Then came the infamous burning of Washington in 1814. British forces with Canadian militia and indigenous allies marched into the Capitol, dined on James and Dolly Madison's unfinished meal, and torched the White House. Legend has it that Dolly managed to save a portrait of George Washington before fleeing. Worst dinner guest ever. For Canadians, the burning of Washington remains a point of pride, an example of standing up to the big guy. For Americans, it's the origin story of why the White House is, well, white. The war's aftermath wasn't much clearer than its start. Both sides claimed victory, but historians tend to agree it was more of a draw. The Treaty of Ghent, signed in 1814, restored pre-war borders and left unresolved questions about territorial disputes to fester for decades. For Canada, the war helped solidify its sense of identity and unity against a common foe. For the US, it spurred a renewed focus on internal development and westward expansion. Perhaps the most iconic outcome is that 2 centuries later, Americans and Canadians argue less about territory and more about whose side is better at hockey or whose bacon is superior. Still, the War of 1812 stands as a reminder that even the closest neighbors can have some spectacularly bad housewarming parties. Fast forward to 1859. The Pig War. This diplomatic debacle was sparked when an American farmer shot a Canadian pig for trespassing in his potato patch. Apparently, even the livestock had no respect for borders. The incident escalated into a standoff between British warships and the USS Massachusetts. Cooler heads prevailed when a British admiral wisely noted, quote, "Starting a war over a pig would be foolish," end quote. Indeed. By the 20th century, relations between the US and Canada had evolved from fiery conflict to something resembling a wary sibling rivalry. But don't let the politeness fool you. Beneath the surface, both nations harbored elaborate invasion plans. just in case. It's like keeping Domino's Pizza on speed dial just in case your Thanksgiving dinner goes poorly. 1921, Canada, still nervous about its southern neighbors' expansionist tendencies, commissioned war hero Buster Brown to draft Defense Scheme No. 1. Armed with a Model T, a Kodak camera, and an undercover persona as an American tourist, Brown scoped out potential invasion routes along the US border. His observations were as cutting as they were strategic, calling Americans, quote, deliberate workers who valued frequent rests and gossip, end quote. His ultimate plan? A lightning-fast, five-pronged attack to capture key US cities like Portland, Albany, and Fargo. And yes, Canada planned to reclaim Maine because apparently once you've tasted lobster rolls, you're not letting them go. Meanwhile, the US wasn't sitting idle. The US War Department developed War Plan Red in the 1930s, a scheme to invade Canada and neutralize British influence in North America. The plan was ambitious, involving naval blockades, strategic troop movements, and even the use of chemical weapons. Yikes. Halifax, Toronto, Vancouver, all were targets in a coordinated attack designed to cripple Canadian infrastructure and secure American dominance. Congress even allocated $57 million for civilian airports along the border that were, spoiler alert, anything but civilian. They were actually military. Despite the tension, both plans had their share of absurdities. For one, Defense Scheme No. 1 relied heavily on the element of surprise, but given that Brown's recon mission involved openly snapping photos of military installations, secrecy wasn't exactly its strong suit. On the flip side, War Plan Red called for the annexation of Niagara Falls to disable Canada's power grid, as if the taking of one of the world's most recognizable landmarks wouldn't raise a few eyebrows. War Plan Red didn't purport to be an easy win. It acknowledged that the Red race, i.e. the British, were more or less weaklings, but noted for their ability to finish a fight. And the report actually warned not to underestimate the Mounties. Smart. The absurdity peaked in 1935 when US war games near the Canadian border made headlines in the New York Times. 36,000 troops participated, and while officially a training exercise, the message wasn't lost on anyone. Canada, however, responded with its signature cool-headedness, shelving Defense Scheme No. 1 and quietly hoping the US would get distracted by something shinier, like the Great Depression and World War II. Ultimately, both plans were decommissioned, with fragments of Canada's scheme literally burned to prevent discovery. War Plan Red languished in classified archives until it was declassified in 1974, much to the delight of a Canadian journalist who unearthed it. Today, these plans are more historical curiosities than serious military blueprints. Still, they're a testament to the peculiar dynamic between two nations that have spent centuries alternately bickering, bantering, and building the world's longest peaceful border. Even so, let's not be too smug. Canadians, ever polite, might just be quietly plotting their revenge, perhaps over a pint of Labatt Blue. They're brainstorming Defense Scheme No. 2. If they ever dust it off, we'll be ready. We've got Texas, and they've got Celine Dion. And as we all know, you don't mess with Texas. That's it for today, friends. My subscribers are mostly from the US and Australia. Canada, are you really gonna let those blokes from down under out-subscribe you? Well, you better hit that subscribe button then. For my Aussies, I'm coming back to you soon with a cool video, and as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Slava Ukraini.